Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
My guest today is Elizebeth Varghese, author of the new book, Stellar Singularity, Navigating the Spacefaring Economy. Elizabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tom. I'm delighted to be here.
That is a very interesting title, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in your introduction, you relate a story about a family vacation in Spain, and you said everything had to become more interesting and possible because we understood the journey. And that theme runs throughout the book. So tell us that story, and how does it relate to space commerce?
Sure. So in the summer of 2022, so last summer, my family, we took a trip to Spain, and it was the first time we were visiting Spain. Now, I speak 4 languages, but I don't speak Spanish. And we have some familiarity with the culture living in New York City, but this was our first trip, right? And I didn't really get a Rosetta Stone or a dictionary to learn Spanish before the trip. It was busy. But when we got there, we obviously read up and learned about the history of the country. I think what we found, much like our journey through space, traveling in a new location, in a new physical or geographical context requires very different skills, a very different mindset, a different language. And I was in the middle of writing the book, so it really kind of reinforced the idea that when we think about how we travel to the space economy, how we look at new space and all the implications of commercial space exploration, there are lots of parallels that typically people who may not be thinking about space as a landscape for commerce can identify with if they think about it as a journey to a new country, right, where you have to learn a language. And what we found, obviously, that the journey, the drive, we took a road trip, traveling to many different countries, to cities, as I write in the book. But each of those cities really became more interesting because we knew what happened there. We understood the history. We understood the people who had been there before us. And I think that's, again, very important for us to keep in mind as we think about the spacefaring economy, because there are lots of parallels for our civilization where we've seen explorations, go in different ways with different outcomes. And we're at a different point in our, evolution where we have to look at the spacefaring economy a little differently than we have in the past. So that was kind of my lesson from, traveling to Spain without knowing the language very well. But the more you learn and the more identifiable the journey is, I think the more we can get out of the experience.
But it's very interesting because I traveled to Europe last summer as well, and we visited London, where people separated by a common language,
right?
But then into France and then on to Italy, and I didn't know French or Italian. But it seemed like everybody there knew English. Does it make a difference that the people that we're trying to talk to understand us, even if we don't understand them when they fall into their jargon?
I think it does. And I think it really represents the level of effort that, people are making, right? It's a two-way conversation. So I think over the years, people are much more welcoming and friendly to tourists who may not know the language, but they do, treat you extra nice when you take the effort to learn a few words, when you try to communicate in their language, even if it's imperfectly. And I think that also kind of represents the mindset we need to have as we explore new space and outer space. We have to make that extra effort to understand, both from a goodwill perspective, but also to, experience the music or the art or the literature, or even just a joke that just doesn't translate sometimes.
That's very true. We were in Switzerland, and when I was able to dig up a little of my high school German, people actually thought I spoke the language, and they started speaking to me in German. It's wait a minute,
right? My confidence goes this far.
Yeah, I just said you've reached the extent of my high school German, and they laughed, and we went on about our business. But back to the book. We're not here to talk about travel, unfortunately, although it's something apparently we both love. But we're here to talk about space commerce, and in the early stages of any industry focuses on the technology that's used to create that very market. But no market can develop or even exist without exploring and understanding and exploiting the human needs, concerns, and consequences. With all that preface, you write that all companies are now space companies. How so?
Yes, I do write that all companies will become space companies. And to use a very simple analogy, I think that we've all lived through, is really one of the internet. And I'll start there. When we were back in the days in the 90s, this is when I started my work in the corporate world. We had companies that were making marked distinctions between, say, retail stores and, the internet commerce sections. You had companies like Barnes and Noble who had completely different organizations working on that. Eventually, I think as we understood the technology more and more, we realized that technology is really the enabler of commerce. It's the enabler of our economy. And there was that integration at the organizational level. There was an integration at the process level, and there was integration at the customer interface or the customer experience level. So that, I think, is a good example of how, we might start out saying that, hey, space or new space is something that's out there. Some companies need it. It's a whole different economy. We don't need to participate, but we're slowly starting to understand that convergence, so that every company that can be or needs to be will be successful, will be the ones that actually harness the potential, the utility that space can provide us, whether it's through satellites or through communications, whether it's through identifying new sources for raw materials, right, through mining. So all of those aspects of what space can provide us through data and technology are what is actually going to help companies be more successful going forward. So I think that integration is inevitable. Everybody may not see it as yet, but we're well on our way to seeing that happen.
Do people realize how much space touches their life every day?
That's a great question. I don't think people do, right? And that's the fascinating thing. Even let's take a company like Walmart, right? So lots of people go to Walmart, go to the store. But since 1987, Walmart actually in 1987 had the biggest network of private satellites. And a big part of why Walmart was so able to be, so successful with managing inventory, managing their supply chain, tracking, things at point of sale, was because they had this technology. They had a private satellite system behind the scenes making all of that happen. But that really wasn't visible. Most people actually don't know this, right? So we've been on that journey for a while. Most people don't understand how technology has enabled, or how space technology has enabled our world the way we see it. People don't always realize that, when you punch something into your GPS as you're trying to get to a movie or a play, the data is actually going all the way up into space, bouncing off a satellite, bouncing off a GPS satellite and coming back to you, right? So we're using space in so many ways that are, I think, remain invisible to people.
And even in my business, I recall back in the days when USA Today was first coming out, the big innovation is that all of the data was being delivered by satellite to a printer, which would then print the newspaper. And that's how they were able to get that kind of a national newspaper. And that was, I'm trying to remember when USA Today was founded, and it was a long time ago. So it's been around for a long time.
That's right. I think what we're seeing is, two things. I think what's making it more visible is the increased commercial activity and the increased, integration or the involvement of media. So we know more, we hear more. It's available more. The latency of information is much lower now. So I think that's some of the things that are actually impinging on our consciousness more. And then, of course, I do think that given some of the geopolitical considerations and what we're seeing from a global economy perspective, those shifts are also making us more conscious of the complexity of, what lies ahead with the space landscape.
Now, you write that you see public-private partnerships as the future of the space economy. Why do you say that?
So one of the things that, we've been observing is obviously, we've seen this explosion of private space endeavor. And, certain individuals have been very pivotal. And Elon Musk is very pivotal in getting the brand, getting the news out on space exploration. And that's a good thing. It benefits all of us. What we've seen historically is that, when governments, when public entities participate and engage in a collaborative fashion with private enterprise, the outcomes are, one, they're more, I wouldn't say equitable, but they're more comprehensive in terms of, how they impact or enable more benefits to society as a whole. So that's, one big reason why, we think public-private partnerships for new space is a good thing. And it's very important to kind of keep in mind that we are also suggesting, and you're seeing that, having private enterprise drive and be fueled and be encouraged is a very important thing. So, it's not that you want only, for example, government space agencies. You want private enterprise. You want private enterprise to participate, to use technology, to push the envelope, to take some of those risks that a government might not be able to do. But when you look at the context of, the impact of all of those things that we're doing, whether it's on the environment, on security, on cybersecurity, having public-private partnerships, having that connection is extremely important. So even from a security and stability perspective, I think we have to kind of keep that in mind. So we're not back in the age of, the East India Company where you have unfettered commercial interests being pursued without cognizance of, the broader implications of what might happen.
Do you see that? Do you make a distinction between a government investment or like a government grant to a startup company and a true public-private partnership, or are they somewhat one and the same?
I think it's a continuum of involvement, right? And we've seen that in the United States, and NASA's done a phenomenal job with engaging private enterprise, and some of that comes in by partnering with smaller companies or startups. Some of that comes by the technology transfer approach that NASA's taken. Some of it, obviously comes through actual active partnerships with SpaceX or Boeing or Lockheed Martin. So I think that continuum of how public-private partnerships evolve or how they manifest themselves in a particular activity might vary based on the need and what we're trying to accomplish. But having that active involvement in the sector, I think, is critical. And I don't want to bring up the recent, and I'll go ahead and do it though, the recent events around cryptocurrency, but lack of regulation or lack of government involvement or regulatory involvement is a problem in some situations. So we live and learn from how different aspects of private enterprise played out.
You talk about the singularity and spacefaring. What do you mean by that?
So singularity is a mathematical term, right? So
Okay.
I'll begin there. And Maxwell, one of my favorite physicists, back in the day, centuries ago now, at this point, really started talking about singularities from a mathematical perspective, where you really you see a point in time where the preceding events really do not impact or define what comes ahead. So it's that point in time. It's that singularity, right? So things become dramatically different. And I use an example of breaking glass in my book, where when a pebble or something hits a piece of glass, what happens after is kind of undefined. We really don't know, right? It could be anything. It could depend on the context. Was it a windshield? Was it a glass of wine? Which could mean that a car crashes or somebody's carpet gets stained, right? The singularity around breaking glass is a good illustration that what happens before doesn't really define or impact. It's a completely different outcome depending on the context. So in that, using that example, when I think about or I define stellar singularity in the book, I'm really talking about how new space and space exploration represents a singularity for us as a civilization. It represents the movement of how we're living, working, engaging with technology, and it's shifting that into this entirely new context, which requires different rules, which requires different ways of working. And we have to really understand that it is a singularity. It requires a different frame of reference to navigate. It's not just, taking things and paradigms or ways we've lived and operated on Earth and translating that into this, different geographical landscape. You can't really drive like you do in New York in Spain. You have to operate differently. You need a different language. So I see stellar singularity as really representing that shift for all of us.
I'm talking with Elizebeth Varghese, author of the new book, Stellar Singularity, Navigating the Spacefaring Economy on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now and click subscribe so you don't miss an episode of the podcast. Or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Elizebeth, you talk about the need for an interstellar Magna Carta. Now, what do you mean by that?
So the Magna Carta, as many of us who may remember our history from school, was really drafted by English barons in the 13th century, right? So, and some of it was really to curtail the excesses of what the king was doing at that point. But it laid out some very important principles, which have been the foundation and really influenced how modern society has thought about democratic aspiration. It's thought about constitutional rights. It's thought about the balance of power, right? So the Magna Carta provided some very interesting considerations, and again, maybe not new, but really the documented considerations that we can still read and look at today. When I talk about an interstellar Magna Carta, I'm not talking about having an agreement with hypothetical civilizations,
Right.
but it's really more Magna Carta among ourselves as inhabitants of our planet, across countries, across transnational corporations, across private enterprise, a way for us to really agree on principles of operating in this new economy, in this stellar singularity. So, I'm making the suggestion that we, as a global community that works in the new space arena, really thinks about what are the key principles that need to guide our agreements, need to guide, what the United Nations Office of Outer Space does, what we do with the different treaties. We need some guiding principles that we need to agree on, not individually and not just by, with a few countries, but really across the board, because inclusivity is also what, made the Magna Carta work. Everyone was united in that ask. And, we need some of those considerations in how we look at things as well. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you can finish your thought, please.
So I did lay out some principles, which I think are, a starting point really for dialogue and discussion. But, we've seen some of that happening, even with how we've laid out principles for ethical artificial intelligence. And, we need something similar for new space. We have to understand that, space is a global commons. We have to understand sentience better. We have to understand, the implications of not bringing along large swaths of population when we experience the benefits of technology and space exploration. So I've laid out some principles, and again, a starting point, but for us to really think about what could be a good interstellar Magna Carta we could work off.
You mentioned transnational, and you also talk about interstellar corporations as well as interstellar remote work, which we've all kind of gotten used to remote work, I guess.
Yes.
But what do you mean by those kinds of terms, the transnational and interstellar corporations and interstellar remote work?
Sure. So I'll take a step back for a second here, before we look at some of those definitions or what we mean by TNCs, which is a term the United Nations has used, really to talk about companies or entities that operate across national boundaries. When you think about the population of our world, we've crossed 8 billion now, right? In November, we crossed that mark. India alone is over, it's 1.5 billion, over 1.5 billion now. So we have a very sizable population across the world that's growing rapidly. The United Nations is estimating that by 2050, from 8 billion, we're going to be well over 9.7 billion. So we're going to grow dramatically. Now, when you think about this population that we have, about 1.4 billion is in Africa, and about 4.7 billion is in Asia. Now, in Africa, about 86% of the population, about 1.2 billion people, are really in the informal economy. And in Asia, that's about 68%. So we're talking about over 3 billion people in Asia. So we're basically saying that, of this massive population we have on the planet, there's a significant chunk of people who are in the informal economy. They're not participating as much in the formal economy. They're not participating as much in using technology to, improve their lives or their businesses. There, lots of people are foraging. There, we have subsistence farming still happening in India and Asia and Africa. So we're seeing this tremendous growth. We're also seeing this big disparity in how people are engaging and operating in the global economy. So that's, just another data point to keep in mind. Now, the third thing that, we kind of need to remember is that when we think about the tremendous growth we're going to experience as a Earth-bound population, I talked about how we're going to go from 8 billion to 9.7 billion, right, in the next 20, 30 years. The United Nations estimates that 50% of this growth, from 8 to 9, that we're going to experience is going to come from 8 countries. And just 8 countries are going to contribute to 50% of the population growth. There are countries like India, the Philippines, Pakistan, Egypt, the Congo, Nigeria, Tanzania, etc. So there's 8 countries. And what we need to, keep in mind, this is the context for our spacefaring economy. Right. We have an Earth-bound population that's growing rapidly, but it's also growing in very different ways, both in terms of the number of people and also in terms of how they're participating in the economy. So that's the landscape that we should not forget. Now, coming to transnational corporations and what we're seeing happen with transnational corporations. Now, transnational corporations, as I said, companies like Apple, like Microsoft, right, or Walmart. These are the companies you and I engage with. Right. I have Apple EarPods on, Shell, all of them. Now, most of these corporations are richer than and more powerful than many nations. Now, about 157 of the world's 200 wealthiest entities. So if you just kind of, said, okay, who are the top 200 wealthiest organizations or entities? Mm-hmm. So of the 200, 157 are actually companies. They're corporations. They're not governments. And if you say, okay, well, let's just look at the top 100, right? Of those, 69 of the top 100 are corporations. They're not countries. Mm-hmm. Or if you take somebody like Apple, you and I both talked about just now, Apple has a valuation of about over 2 trillion in 2021. Right. That makes it larger than 96% of all the world's economies measured by GDP. Only 7 countries on our planet have a larger economy than Apple. So corporations and transnational corporations they're real players. We don't always think about that, right? From a power equation or from a resource equation, they're significant participants in our global economy, maybe not as visible, and they're going to be significant participants in the new space economy. So it's really important for us to understand this, this intersection of how our global community operates and how TNCs actually, are part of the solution or the problem in some cases.
And maybe most importantly, Elizabeth, you talk about leadership. So what do you see as fundamental for spacefaring leadership?
So I write about, 4 different aspects of stellar leadership. And then those are really, true competence, integrity, clarity, and empathy. So I talk about those 4 principles. Again, not really revolutionary, right? I mean, those are things we all acknowledge leaders need. Right. I think the most important one that, we really should start is around integrity. And what we're observing globally is that there is a shift in the narrative around what constitutes integrity, what constitutes the rule of law, right? There are many different actors and players, and their ability to impact others, is moved beyond the traditional methods of, war or espionage, right? Cyber hackers can take down an economy. The hackers were able to hack into NASA satellite dish network in 2019 and steal Mars mission data. We're seeing that, based on Freedom House Project's 2021 Freedom in the World assessment, there was a sharp decline in global, democracy. Less than 1/5 of our global population live in truly free countries, right? So we're seeing some of these tremendous shifts around what's happening in the global landscape, and having true integrity in leadership, defining what that really means from a standards perspective as we look at leaders of transnational corporations or leaders of public agencies or leaders of nation states is really, really important, because that has implications not just on the country or the entity, but on this, on all of us, right? So that's so I talk about that quite a bit. The other aspects are, just touch upon clarity for a second. We are moving into stellar singularity, whether we like it or not.
Right.
And the waters are muddy. The telescopic images have latency. We don't really know what we don't know, or we're acknowledging that more actively now. So it's really important as we navigate to have clarity around, our objectives, around our principles, clarity around how we will solve problems, how we will engage, how we will handle conflict. So some of those things are really important for it. So, you need leaders who understand all of that because they have true competence and they have integrity, but then can use that to really forge clarity of purpose, of a path going forward. But all of that really has to be anchored with true empathy, because if we have leaders who don't really get it, who or make understand the intellectual argument, they understand the intellectual proposition, but don't really acknowledge or take as much time for the human component, it falls by the wayside. So even as we advocate for integrity and competence and clarity, empathy is really going to become one of the most important traits, especially as we work remotely across distances and across planets someday.
Well, I hope we haven't given away too much. When is your book available and how can people get a hold of it?
Yeah, so the book is available on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
The paperback will be out in a couple of days, and should be available both on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So yes, would love to have folks read, provide feedback, review the book, and really use it as a starting point to understand the spacefaring economy we're all part of, whether we know it fully or not.
And we'll include a link on Ex Terra as well to that Amazon copy. So, Elizebeth, one thing more, and we do this with all of our guests, to ask you to look out, if you would, over the next 10 to 15 years or so in space commerce, and tell us what your crystal ball tells you.
That's a really good question. What I see happening in the next 10 years is, first on planet Earth itself, we're going to see an integration of commerce and business with space. So, what I mentioned, like every company will be a space company. We're going to see that become much more real. We're going to see much more, regulatory conversations around that. That's going to happen. We're going to see that become more visible. We're going to see the barriers dissolve between brick and mortar or, earthbound companies in space, like we did with the internet world. So I think that barrier will become, permeable. It'll cease to exist. So that's the first thing that I'm we're likely to expect. I think we're also going to see a lot more crewed missions out. As we know, NASA has a plan, China has a plan. Many more countries are going to be setting out crewed missions. We are going to see lunar bases. Again, all of this is true, right? So none of this is, again, new news.
Right.
But as an outcome of all of that, we are going to see differences in how, conflict emerges. We are going to see a greater need for dialogue. And in some ways, we are going to see greater polarization that we will have to navigate around. So I think that's going to be a geopolitical reality just coming from the fact that, we will be having more people out in orbit. Eventually, I think, we are going to see more practical applications of commerce and technology that would transform what we're seeing here on Earth, whether it's mining of substances on the moon or asteroids. Many of those things are going to become reality, and my fervent hope is that all those benefits that we tap into are really harnessed for the good of the entire global community, and we actively work to ensure that our silos of privilege or access do not continue to grow, which is, quite possible given the pace at which we're moving forward.
Elizebeth, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Tom, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Elizebeth Varghese is the author of the new book, Stellar Singularity, Navigating the Spacefaring Economy. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click on subscribe so you don't miss an episode of the podcast or any of our other videos. You can also get daily space commerce news at xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter at Ex Terra JSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers. My Galileo through his looking glass. That's for reason. A dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, know my view. Like finding water on the moon.